a sprawling tapestry of royalty, gilded halls, intricate family lines, and crowns that change hands in the blink of an eye. At the heart of this swirl is Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, better known to history simply as Queen Mary, consort to King George V, and mother to 2 kings in her lifetime. Mary's journey began with something closer to a cautionary tale than a fairy tale. A family so strapped for cash they had to flee their home, a mother nicknamed Fat Mary, and an early reputation for being very German-looking, hardly the markers of a future queen consort who'd shape modern Europe. Yet behind her conservative wardrobe and a famously regal bearing lurked a woman of keen intellect, fierce loyalty, and ruthless pragmatism, destined to become a linchpin in the British monarchy. So settle in, because this is the surprisingly dramatic saga of Mary of Teck, the mother of dynasties. She arrived in the world in 1867, born in the very same room that her distant cousin, Queen Victoria, had been born in decades earlier. It might sound auspicious, but Mary was no straightforward golden child princess. Yes, she was given the suitably grand name Victoria Mary Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine Agnes. But that didn't change the unvarnished truth. Her parents were not the cream of the crop in royal circles. Her mother was Princess Mary Adelaide, who had scandalized the upper crust by marrying Francis, the Duke of Teck, a man from a German lineage considered at best borderline legitimate, and at worst a black sheep among blue bloods. And if that weren't dicey enough, Fat Mary, Mary's mother, was a spendaholic. She lived well beyond her means on lush feasts, expensive clothes, and vacations abroad. This might have been perfectly fine if they'd been flush with funds, but the House of Teck was anything but wealthy. Before long, their finances crumbled so badly that the entire family had to flee England in 1883 to escape their many creditors. Imagine the young Victoria Mary whisked away to the European continent in an effort to lie low with more generous or gullible relatives. There she was, caught between royalty and exile, marking time as the Teck clan pretended this was all just a long holiday. By the time they crept back to England in 1885, Mary had become accustomed to wearing something of a scarlet letter, a reminder that not all princesses lead charmed lives. Still, Mary's childhood wasn't wholly joyless. Her parents adored her, calling her May because she was born in that month. Her father, though overshadowed by his wife's giant personality, could be gentle and merry. Sometimes they'd all share a laugh in the sitting room, but at other times, the mood in the household turned draconian. Mary learned, early on, to navigate mood swings in those around her, perhaps a skill that would later serve her well in the cutthroat environment of royal courts. Yet the real complication for teenage Mary was her social standing. She was a princess, yes, but from the wrong branch of the family tree. When you're a young noblewoman in the late 19th century, you're expected to marry up, or at the very least sideways. In Mary's case, that was easier said than done. The higher rungs of the aristocracy sniffed at the Teck name, branding the family as impoverished and less than pure in regal terms. Mary herself, though polite and well-behaved, wasn't considered a famed beauty. People described her as very German-looking, which in the Anglo-centric swirl of Victorian society was far from a compliment. In short, suitors were not lining up outside her door. Enter Queen Victoria, the matriarch who had a knack for matchmaking among her many grandchildren and extended relations. The old monarch's eye fell upon Mary of Teck when searching for a prospective bride for Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert Victor, known to friends and family as Eddie. Suddenly, the Teck's pariah status melted away. The logic was simple. Mary was one of the few British princesses available, so why not hitch her to the prince who was second in line for the throne? This had little to do with Mary's personal attributes and everything to do with the monarchy's need to secure the lineage. But, in the late 19th century, that was par for the course. On the surface, Albert Victor might have seemed a dream catch. He was tall, came from a direct line to the crown, and possessed the outward trappings of a princely gentleman. However, once you scratched that surface, you found a swirl of troubling rumors and facts. Some said Albert Victor, often described as a sweet but dull individual, had fathered a secret love child. Others accused him of consorting with questionable types in the London night scene. Most disturbingly, a few conspiracists pointed the finger at him as a suspect for Jack the Ripper. These allegations were unproven, but the hush-hush scandal had a way of clinging to his name. Queen Victoria soldiered on, ignoring the whispers. Eddie needed a bride, Mary needed a husband, so a betrothal seemed inevitable. In December 1891, at a grand home called Luton Hoo, Albert Victor got down on one knee and asked for Mary's hand. She said yes, presumably relieved to have found a path out of the gloom that surrounded her family. The match made sense politically. Never mind that the personalities involved were basically strangers to each other. But life had other plans. 6 weeks after the engagement, Prince Albert Victor died in the influenza epidemic sweeping across Europe. Just like that, Mary's entire future disintegrated. She had pinned her hopes on becoming a royal wife, and for a brief moment, she'd carried the hopes of the nation as well. Suddenly, that prospective crown vanished into thin air. Even worse, rumors surfaced that Albert Victor had barely spared a thought for his fiancée on his deathbed. According to certain accounts, he called out in delirium for a past lover, not for Mary. Then he passed away just days after his 28th birthday, leaving Mary alone, humiliated and grieving. At Albert's funeral, the solemn young woman laid her bridal wreath on his coffin in a heartbreaking gesture of farewell. What followed might sound like something from a soap opera. Mary began to grow close to Albert Victor's younger brother, Prince George, future George V. Initially, it wasn't some grand romantic spark. Both were grieving Albert, and Queen Victoria, ever the puppet master of royal marriages, recognized a chance to keep Mary in the family. After all, the monarchy had warmed up to her and didn't want to waste a respectable princess who already understood the royals' obligations. For George, the proposition was complicated. He was shy and had been spurned a short while earlier by Princess Marie of Edinburgh, leaving him with a bruised ego. Plus, the idea of courting his dead brother's fiancée felt awkward to him. But the crown's needs outweighed personal misgivings. A sense of duty, that intangible driver of so many royal unions, tugged them together. It helped that George found Mary intelligent and steady, 2 qualities he admired. They spent time dancing awkwardly around each other. Their relatives arranged opportunities to get them alone, including the now famous scenario in which someone suggested they go look at frogs in a palace pond so that George could propose. Yes, it was that contrived, but for these 2 diffident people, it worked. George finally mustered the courage to pop the question, and Mary, once again, said yes. It might sound like a rebound scenario, but, as events would show, their marriage blossomed into something that neither had fully anticipated. They wed on July 6, 1893, in a ceremony fit for a future king and queen. Mary had to discard the wedding dress she'd designed for her doomed nuptials with Albert Victor and quickly commission a new masterpiece of fine lace and diamonds. On the morning of the big event, a small but telling moment occurred. As Mary was walking through Buckingham Palace, George glimpsed her from down the hall. Instead of ducking away, he took a formal bow, one that conveyed respect, admiration, and perhaps a hint of genuine affection. Such gestures can be superficial in a royal setting, but Mary was touched. For a couple that had come together under the shadow of tragedy, this was a sign of something more sincere taking root. Their union quickly proved unexpectedly strong. Unlike so many royals of his era, George never took a mistress. By the time they were firmly settled into conjugal life, the two found themselves deeply in love. Mary became pregnant with their first child, Prince Edward, future Edward VIII, and before long, the couple had a bustling brood of 6 children: Edward, Albert, future George VI, Mary, Henry, George, and John. You might think that with 6 kiddos in the nursery, Mary was a doting mother. The reality was more complicated. Royal traditions of the time often placed children in the care of nannies for hours, sometimes days, on end. Mary had plenty of formal duties, philanthropic visits, and social appearances as the Duchess of York, then later as Princess of Wales. She and George did share moments of real family unity, but the day-to-day childcare was left to employees who weren't always kind. In one especially awful case, a nanny would pinch the boys, Edward and Albert, right before they were to spend time with Mary. Naturally, they'd burst into tears and be hustled back to the nursery, where the nanny had them all to herself again. Mary only discovered the nanny's cruelty after a drawn-out period. While she dismissed the culprit immediately upon finding out, the damage had already been done. This pattern, of Mary being somewhat removed from her children's emotional lives, would continue for years, culminating in tragedies she could never fully control. The most harrowing case was her 6th and youngest child, Prince John. Unlike his older siblings, little John was sickly from birth. Mary suffered a punishing labor, and although she recovered, John faced respiratory issues early on. As he got older, he exhibited unpredictable behavior, and around age 4, he experienced his first major seizure. Doctors diagnosed him with epilepsy, which society at the time viewed with a stigma that even royals couldn't escape. George and Mary took the route of secrecy, isolating John from the public eye, presumably to protect him from the glare of gossip, though critics have often pointed out how it might also have shielded the monarchy from embarrassment. As the 1910s approached, Mary and George saw their status shift again. King Edward VII, George's father, died in 1910, which meant the Prince and Princess of Wales now became King George V and Queen Mary. This was the moment Mary had known would arrive since she accepted George's proposal, but it still brought seismic changes to her life. One immediate complication was her mother-in-law, Queen Alexandra. Bitter in her widowhood and slow to vacate Buckingham Palace, Alexandra took it upon herself to spirit away some of the crown jewels that technically belonged to Mary now. It set an awkward tone for Mary's early days as queen, though Mary's biggest annoyance might have been her husband's reaction to her name. George loathed the double Victoria Mary signature and insisted she drop Victoria. She complied, taking the official style, Queen Mary, a simpler moniker that would follow her for the rest of her life. No sooner had the dust settled on the coronation than Europe hurtled toward the catastrophe of the First World War. Queen Mary, stepping into her role, insisted that Buckingham Palace adopt rationing like regular British families, cutting back on extravagances to show solidarity. She toured hospitals to visit wounded soldiers, an experience that weighed heavily on her psyche. Through it all, she stood beside George, who was constitutionally bound to lead the country in a time of crisis, and whose heavy smoking and stress would soon take a monstrous toll on his health. But Mary had to bear the weight of other heartaches as well. During the Bolshevik Revolution, her husband's cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, pleaded for asylum. Mary's side of the family had close ties to various German and Russian dynasties, so she was certainly aware of the Romanovs' desperation. But George, with Mary's tacit or overt agreement, refused to offer them safe haven, fearing it would stoke public resentment against the royals. The result was that Nicholas II and his family were later murdered by the revolutionaries, a tragedy that haunted George for the rest of his life. In the aftermath, Mary never publicly discussed the Romanov fiasco in detail, but the refusal cast a shadow that never fully lifted. Back at home, tragedy also reached into Mary's own family. Prince John died in 1919 at just 13 years old, after a severe epileptic seizure. By all accounts, Mary was devastated, writing in her diary that the loss was a terrible shock. Yet she also confided in a friend that John's passing was a great relief, referencing how the boy's condition had progressively worsened, leaving him in an almost continual state of suffering. Such a statement sounds callous out of context, but it may reflect the raw complexity of Mary's emotional world. Heartbreak laced with relief that her child was no longer in pain. The Monarchy, in its stoic Victorian Edwardian style, gave little space for open vulnerability. In the 1920s, Mary's attention turned toward another kind of heartbreak. King George V's deteriorating health. Years of smoking and the stress of World War I had ravaged him. He developed bronchitis, pleurisy, and septicemia, among other ailments. Mary proved an attentive nurse, orchestrating his schedule to ensure rest, fussing over his diet, and essentially saving his life multiple times. One doctor even quipped that the king's recovery was more Queen Mary's doing than any medical intervention. The couple's bond seemed to deepen with each new trial. During the Silver Jubilee celebrations in 1935, marking 25 years of George's reign, he made a speech in which he placed references to Mary at the very end, so he could hold back tears until the last possible moment. Despite their public reserve, it's clear the two had a love story rooted in mutual respect, perseverance, and genuine affection. Then, in early 1936, George's luck finally ran out. After complaining of a cold, he took to his bed at Sandringham House and never rose again. On January 20th, he passed. Later, it emerged that his personal physician had administered a fatal injection of morphine, effectively euthanizing the king in order to preserve his dignity and ensure his death was reported in the morning papers rather than in some messy overnight swirl of rumor. There is no sign Mary knew of this shocking measure, and given her devout religious nature, she might have been horrified. With George gone, Mary took on the role of Queen Dowager. But even in that capacity, she had to deal with another avalanche of drama, courtesy of her eldest son Edward, now Edward VIII. Edward was charming, glamorous, and famously attached to the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. He'd apparently inherited none of his father's sense of measured duty. In 1936, as if Britain weren't already reeling from losing George, Edward announced that he intended to marry Simpson, igniting a constitutional crisis. The Church of England and the government strongly opposed the match, since Wallis was not only American, but twice divorced. Mary herself considered Simpson wholly unsuitable, refusing even to meet her future daughter-in-law. Despite her pleas, Edward chose love over duty and abdicated before the year was out. Mary was furious. She never fully forgave Edward for what she saw as a gross betrayal, not just of the crown, but of his late father's memory. Her heartbreak at losing her husband, followed so quickly by Edward giving up the throne, must have cut deep. the monarchy was forced to pivot to her second son, Prince Albert, the so-called Bertie, who reluctantly became King George VI in 1936, with Mary taking the position of Queen Mother. She proved an invaluable source of knowledge for her new sovereign son, drawing on her thorough understanding of tradition and royal protocol. But the Queen Mother also pursued more personal interests, some of which triggered gossip around court. Mary was known to be an enthusiastic collector of jewelry, art, and historical memorabilia, sometimes to an extreme. Critics whispered that if she visited your estate and happened to admire a piece on your mantel, you were obligated, by courtesy, to present it to her as a gift. She made note of items in royal inventories that had never been returned and sent pointed letters demanding their immediate surrender. Some even alleged she was borderline kleptomaniac, a rumor that entered the pop culture lexicon and was humorously referenced in works like the Downton Abbey film. Whether she was truly a magpie or simply an avid archivist of royal artifacts is up for debate, but the stories certainly reveal another facet of her personality. Mary was formidable when she wanted something. In the midst of these curiosities, Mary still played the role of matriarch. She doted on her grandchildren, particularly the future Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret, making sure they got a more substantive education than might have been standard for young royals. She recognized the monarchy was evolving and wanted these princesses to be better prepared for a world drastically different from the Victorian era in which she'd grown up. Then came yet another painful loss. In 1952, her beloved second son, King George VI, died of complications from lung cancer at the relatively young age of 56. Mary was now forced to watch Elizabeth II ascend the throne. By then, in her mid-80s, Mary had outlived 3 of her children, Prince John, King George VI, and one daughter who died stillborn, and the emotional toll was enormous. She confessed to a friend that she had lost 3 sons, but I have never been privileged to be there to say a last farewell to them. In March of 1953, just a few weeks shy of Elizabeth's coronation, Mary herself passed away at the age of 85. In a final flourish of duty, she had left explicit instructions that her death should not postpone the coronation, even though tradition might have dictated a mourning period. She insisted that the show must go on, a stoic reflection of her lifelong motto: keep calm and carry on. Far away from the formal funeral rites, her eldest son, Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, who had abdicated for Wallis Simpson, wrote a bitter letter in which he described Mary as having been hard and cruel to him, even in her final years. He claimed her veins were icy cold, just as they would be in death. This scathing remark served as a final reminder of the rift that had never healed after Edward's abdication, a wound inflicted on Mary's sense of duty and pride that she simply couldn't bring herself to reconcile. And so ends the tale of Mary of Teck, the hidden queen whose name might not echo with the same grandeur as Victoria or Elizabeth, but whose influence is woven into the very fabric of modern royalty. From that precarious start as a rejected princess to her final bow at 85, she saw it all: an exiled youth, 2 engagements, 6 children, a devastating war, the tragic death of her baby boy, her husband's slow demise, the fiasco of an abdication, and the dawn of a new era under her granddaughter. In each step, she maintained a composure that many found intimidating, but also quietly reassuring. The stoicism wasn't just for show. It was a survival mechanism, shaped by a life that refused to grant her many easy breaks. Duty, continuity, collect what must be collected, preserve what must be preserved, say farewell to the lost, and prepare the next generation for the burden of the crown. That was Mary of Teck, a queen consort who wore heartbreak and diamonds in equal measure, and ultimately, the mother of modern dynasties.